I'm going to call the meeting to order now. This is a special meeting of the Urbana Tree Commission, and the primary focus of this meeting is the removal of the hackberry tree at 312 South Kohler Avenue. If you want to make a comment, you can submit a card now, or we don't want to stifle anybody speaking. You can also get up and we'll get a card from you later. And you can speak or also just give your input in writing here. We're going to have a call to order. Again, the purpose of the meeting is to actually take input, and we will have a vote on the proposition to remove the tree expeditiously. And it'll be a straight up or down vote at the end of the sessions. Basically, we're going to have public input first. You have 5 minutes. Anybody that has submitted a card or wants to get up, feels the urge to speak during the meeting. And then we'll have a presentation by our city arborist, Mike Brunk, on some of the physical aspects of this tree and needs for management. And please hold your questions until after the presentation. So if you have questions for Mike or general questions for members of the Tree Commission, hold them until that point, because many of your questions may be answered in the course of his presentation, and that will move us along expeditiously. There may be a couple, I have something I'm going to read, and there may be some comments from other members of the Tree Commission prior to the question session. And with that, we'll proceed. We'll do a roll call, and members of the Tree Commission can identify themselves or their areas of expertise if they wish, or by their area of expertise. We have a mix of people with some professional backgrounds relating to ecology, woody plants, and we also have citizen members. We do have a quorum. There are only 2 members missing, and we will proceed with the roll call.
Barbara Anderson. Carol Augsburger.
Present.
Stuart Burlacher.
I'm present. Was this the opportunity to?
Jeff Dawson.
Present.
Darren Eastburn. Tom Fairman.
Here.
Derek Liebert. Michael Stevenson.
Here.
Michael Brunk.
Okay, thank you. We'll start right off with questions. We have quite a few, or I'm sorry, the requests to speak, and there's one for me to read. Stephen Wald first would like to speak. So, Stephen?
Check. Good evening. My name is Steve Wald. I live at 611 West Illinois Street. 2 days before Christmas, my 2 sons and I were out for an afternoon bike ride. We passed the enormous hackberry that grows a block from our house, and we greeted it as we always do. There's the biggest tree in the world. On the way home, we noticed that the gnarly little cherry tree that suffers under the power lines at the same address, the so-called tire swing tree, was marked for removal. We stopped and pondered that for a bit, because the tire swing tree is a sentimental favorite in this part of our neighborhood, part of its offbeat and funky character. And as we pondered its loss, we suddenly noticed that the giant hackberry tree, too, was marked with a white dot. I understood from Mike Brunk's calm and complete explanation that the tree's condition was grave and that its removal probably inevitable. He explained that the tree could be removed at any time, as soon as the following Monday. But Mike was not at all dismissive of my concern. In fact, Mike encouraged me to speak up about it. So I was encouraged, and by Monday morning I believe Mike had received something like 20 letters or phone calls about the tree. He delayed its removal and called tonight's meeting to discuss the tree's condition. And he provided a thorough history of his stewardship of the tree, which I expect we will hear more about later tonight. I'd like to touch on several items in my initial letter to Mike. The first is to verify the size and significance of this tree in the city's forest. This is the largest tree in Urbana, and it's now listed as a contending state champion hackberry in the Illinois Big Tree Register. It could be as old as 200 years. Its soaring limbs rise above the surrounding canopy, balancing with natural grandeur the iconic man-made monuments of our city. And I realized I forgot to start my slideshow, and I'm going to pull up the picture that shows that. We've asked the city to explore all options to retain this tree, soliciting outside expertise and equipment as necessary to articulate for public consideration just what it would take to allow this tree to continue to prosper and grow. Given its size and significance, and given the public support that this tree has inspired as a living monument, extraordinary efforts are warranted for its preservation, as neighbor Richard Moore has so eloquently stated. I understand the Arbor Division and others have been working hard on this, and I hopefully await their findings. Since 2009, the City Council established a goal to record and mark trees of significant height and growth and provide public notice when significant trees are removed. Last spring, the Council passed a legacy tree ordinance, but no legacy trees have been designated to date. The Judge Joseph Walter Sim Hackberry was nominated to be the city's first legacy tree on December 30th. The nomination has not been acted upon and may never be acted upon, because a provision in the ordinance requires a legacy tree to be found in good or better condition, and the city says this hackberry does not qualify. How ironic that the city's largest and most majestic tree, one of its oldest and most historic trees, one of its most unique hackberries in branch structure and form, one of the highest value trees ecologically in terms of water retention, a food source for wildlife, and carbon sequestration, and finally the city's sole listing in the Illinois Big Tree Registry. How ironic that it does not qualify for a wholly voluntary and non-binding legacy program. Denying this tree in its hour of reckoning, the first and only official recognition available to it in the municipal code, seems to me an egregious oversight and completely contrary to the intent of the council, the public, probably everyone in this room. The legacy program at its core is about public recognition and public participation. And today we are demonstrating as a community how constructive and valuable that can be to the long-term stewardship of our trees. You must find a way to name the Sim Hackberry the city's first legacy tree. You should do it tonight as your first order of business. Finally, in my letter, I discussed options if the tree does have to be removed, options other than the chipper. It's premature to explore any of that in detail before the path forward is explored and resolved. So tonight, I encourage you to continue to involve the community in the ongoing management of this tree. Really, every public tree in Urbana deserves the notice and comment provisions in the legacy tree ordinance, the hackberry and the tire swing tree, all of them. Because hundreds of communities across the country have this as a routine practice, because transparency and public input lead to better outcomes, as we will see tonight. Every possible outcome for this tree will be better as a result of public input than it would have been if it had been left to simply fall in anonymity over Christmas break. Managing natural resources is difficult. Tree stewardship is a highly technical, but not merely technical exercise. Thank you for your commitment to involving the public in these important decisions.
Thank you. Jack White?
I'm John White. I've lived at 904 South Anderson in Urbana for 39 years. When the state of Illinois established its program to recognize champion-sized trees, it started with a list that was submitted by two tree lovers, a man from a suburb of Chicago and a country boy from central Illinois. That was in 1969. Of the 17 champion trees that I identified back then, not one of them is still alive. About half of them stood in the way of progress, and the rest of them died of natural causes. The fact is, a very big tree is a very old tree, and it's often past its prime and near the end of its life. The state of Illinois has another program to identify old growth forests, not just big trees, individual trees. And like Urbana's legacy tree program, the state has a set of criteria for determining what qualifies as an old growth forest. There's a fundamental difference between the two programs, though. Urbana requires that the landowner agree to the designation, and Urbana wants the legacy tree to be in good condition. In contrast, the state of Illinois will recognize an old-growth forest regardless of what the landowner thinks, and even if the owner intends to destroy the forest. That's the purpose of the state's program, to preserve the forests. I can understand why Urbana's program requires the owner's permission, but I don't really see why a legacy tree must be in good health. A tree's physical condition is irrelevant to its historical significance. Look at it this way. In a White House ceremony, the president did not refuse to pin the Medal of Honor on Stephen Hawking's chest just because Stephen Hawking couldn't stand up to receive it. If you must cut some limbs from the major sim hackberry, are you sure you must go ahead and kill it too? We admire Venus de Milo even though she has no arms. Here is what I want the City of Urbana and the Urbana Tree Commission to do. Designate the major sim hackberry as a legacy tree. If you can't do that because of some procedural issue, then please change the procedure. And if you can't do that, then please just go ahead anyway and treat the major sim hackberry as a special tree that it is. Give it the care that it deserves and that so many Urbana citizens are calling for.
Thank you very much, Jack. Eric Sachs.
I'm a homeowner on High Street, about a block and a half from this tree, and I'd like to strongly support the preservation of this tree if at all possible. It's certainly a tree of great value and of great beauty. It adds value to the properties in that neighborhood and to Urbana as a whole. Moreover, it's a heritage tree. It is linking us back to our history and the beginnings of Urbana, so we should really respect that. I was kind of surprised to hear that the tree was possibly going to be cut down. It appears, in the summertime at least, to be quite healthy. I noticed that this huge storm that we had the other week with 35-mile-an-hour winds and 60-mile-an-hour gusts didn't lose a branch. I've seen lots of other trees lose a lot more. So I'm surprised, and I guess we'll hear more about its health. You can't always tell just by looking at a tree how healthy it is. Obviously, the tree will have a limited life, you know, as all trees do, and some planning should have been made, perhaps in the past, and still can be made for the future. I think a good tribute to this tree would be to plant some of its progeny nearby, so that there's always a large hackberry tree there. These are important native species to this part of the central U.S., and it also speaks to the kind of habitat that was here before the land was drained and houses were built and roads were paved. One way would be plant seedlings, as I mentioned, and another might be to clone the tree and put essentially a clone nearby, or a few of them. But I would hope that this tree can be saved. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Eric. Dennis Roberts is next.
Hello, members of the Tree Commission. I am Dennis Roberts, and I live on Green Street in East Urbana. But I've received quite a few calls and emails concerning this tree, so I have prepared some comments about it. And I have also a few visual items to show. I don't have a slide presentation, but I will hold up some images. First, I was a little bit concerned that when I read the agenda tonight, one of the items on the agenda is the removal of the hackberry. I had preferred that the commissioners hadn't preformed an opinion about it, and that the topic might have been called discussion. But maybe that's merely a technical item. So let me read some comments that I prepared for you. So I greet you this evening during this important special meeting of the Tree Commission, which is convened to hear information about the future of the giant hackberry tree on the corner of West High Street and South Kohler in Urbana. I deeply appreciate your willingness to hold this meeting and to hear the public input on it concerning the fate of the tree. And I appreciate the efforts of Mike Brunk, our arborist, to accommodate the public in this discussion. As you know, this tree is of considerable size and significance, and you have undoubtedly heard from many citizens, and you will hear tonight, people who are petitioning for the preservation of the tree, and others who perhaps will express concerns on its viability. No one can doubt its immense size, and we have learned that it may well be one of the largest trees in Urbana by height, canopy spread, and circumference, and it must be perhaps a champion grade example of the species of hackberry in the state of Illinois. This is certainly a significant tree in our community, and we certainly hope that it can be preserved. Just to touch a little bit on the history of the area, it is believed that this tree probably grew naturally along a small tributary of the Boneyard Creek, which is seen in the bird's eye view map of Urbana, and I will hold up a copy of that illustration for you to see, and you also have this on your packet at the desk. And the Boneyard Creek is shown on this map of 1869 as running across the city, but you'll notice that there is a tributary running north and south I marked in blue, and the hackberry is within about half a block of that tributary. This map shows the area where the tree grows, and it happens also to have been on the property owned by Judge Joseph W. Sim, the husband of Sarah Busey, the daughter of Matthew W. Busey, an early pioneer of Urbana. Judge Sim served as the mayor of Urbana from 1864 to 1866, so he was the mayor of Urbana, and this tree is on his property. He was a county court judge from 1873 until 1877. And at the time, and at some time, he was also a law partner of J.O. Cunningham, who wrote a famous biography and history of the county. The hackberry was probably a young tree at the time of Abe Lincoln, who went practicing law in the 8th Judicial Circuit, and estimates of its age are from 150 to 200 years old. This is a picture taken from Pioneers of Champaign County of Judge Sim. This is an indication of the location of his house in property in the city of Urbana, with a red dot indicating where the tree is. And also, I'd like to draw your attention to this interesting article which appeared in the News Gazette. There was an ancient tree on Main Street associated with Abraham Lincoln. We've recently made this a historic marker tree. And this is a tree which was venerated even in 1902 by people who passed by, and at the time, all it was a 25-foot high stump. The commission has received the nomination for this tree as a legacy tree status. Of the 8 possible earmarks defined in the legacy tree ordinance, this tree meets 6, namely by size, historic or notable event, age, location. I would also include aesthetics. If properly measured and recorded, it may well be entered as one of the Illinois or National Registers of Big Trees, and this certainly qualifies for a nomination on multiple points for legacy tree status. And I encourage the commission to consider it. Is that my time? Okay. I think that, to conclude, preservation, not removal, is a just request of the commission. Certainly, judicious trimming and support is preferable to total clear cutting of the tree. And I hope that the commissioners have the compassion to see that and listen to the people's voice. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dennis. Our next commenter is Gary Stensland.
I'm Gary Stensla, and I live at 311 East Holmes in Urbana. In my retirement years, trees are a focal point for me. I take thousands of pictures of fall color, and in the last couple of years, I've added measuring the circumference of big trees that I see. And strictly just a hobby. And to be officially declared a record tree, you have to measure the canopy width, the height, and the circumference of the tree. But the latter two are a little hard for me to measure, and I can quickly take my 100-foot tape and measure the circumference. So that's what I've been doing. I've measured something like 400 trees across the country as I go on trips and stuff, maybe measured 100 in Urbana. And so in terms of circumference, I would note that the hackberry that we're talking about, just of those that I've measured and looked at, it's in fact third largest in circumference. There's two bur oaks that I think you're all familiar with that in fact are larger in circumference. The hackberry, therefore, with my small data set, is the third largest in Urbana, covering across all species that I've measured, maybe 25 different species so far. Basically, I would like to see that the tree would be kept, that it would not be cut down, that some appropriate trimming and cabling be done to extend the life of the tree, and that a sign be put on the tree to note its size or relative size. I want to support the previous comment where important trees are often going to be old trees and therefore often are going to be in rather poor shape. This tree would fall in that category, but I would hate to see us give up on this tree because of its poor shape. And I want to note a cottonwood tree. By the way, the biggest circumference tree that I've measured in Illinois is the cottonwood tree over at Ogden. I was going to give you the numbers. That one has a circumference of about 249 inches. The hackberry that we're talking about now has a circumference of about 195 inches. And the bur oak near the Quaker meeting place is 206, and the bur oak on Brownfield Road is about 200 inches, according to my measurements. My last comment would be to bring up an article that was in the Denver Post about a year and a half ago, and it noted the death of a record cottonwood tree, and I believe it was the U.S. record cottonwood tree. And when I went on vacation out there a few months later, I managed to go up and look at that tree. And the article noted that the death meant the last little sign of life was gone. So I could imagine, maybe there were 100 leaves left on one branch and they were still calling it alive. But finally they had to declare that it was dead. And so it obviously was around a long time in bad shape. And it was a very noteworthy tree if it makes it to the Denver Post in a major article to observe its final demise. And I think the tree, in fact, is going to stand for quite a bit longer. It's in a location where falling and damaging people or property is not an issue, so they can just let it fade away, I think. And I would expect it'll be many years yet that'll be standing there, and I can go back and check on it and in future trips. Thank you for listening to me tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Stensland. Ilona Metkovsky.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for letting us state our opinions to you tonight. I am here to speak for the preservation of the giant hackberry tree. I love this tree. It was one of the first things I noticed when I came to this city over 20 years ago, and I have loved this tree since then, and always considered it to be the biggest tree in Urbana, even though I didn't know if it was in fact. I was very sad to see that it was put on the list of trees to be cut down, and I would like to convince you tonight to abandon that decision. Since people have talked a lot about the tree already, I don't want to say more about it, but I would like to talk about a similar situation, not quite the same, to just let people know that trees can be saved. If there is a will, there is a way, and trees can be saved even when they are not even alive anymore, and there is very little left of them. With the will of people. Such a situation was recorded in a 2011 professional preservation journal, and the tree that was saved was about 1,000-year-old red cedar tree in Stanley Park, Vancouver, Canada. The tree was very favored tourist attraction for as long as people could remember, and survived many, many storms. In 2006, there was a hurricane strength storm which leveled about 10,000 mature trees around this cedar. But the cedar still stood. The interesting thing about this cedar is that it was in fact dead already, at least for 160 years. This was not a live tree, but it was still standing. It had hardly any roots, but it was still hanging on, and its crown was entirely gone. It was merely a 50-foot high stump. The inside of the tree was entirely hollow. Tourists but it was so gigantic that tourists took pictures inside the hollow within their cars. They took elephants inside it to take photographs already 100 years ago. After the 2006 hurricane strength storm, the park commissioners decided that the tree had to be cut down. And in spite of citizens' concern, they stuck to their guns. Eventually, however, they turned around and gave 150 days to come up with some solution to save the tree. It required, of course, significant expenses and kind of engineering knowledge that has never been thought about. And this all happened. The citizens formed a commission, and with a lot of labor input and donations from the citizens, and the knowledge of certain university professors in Vancouver, they ended up saving the tree with a kind of magical engineering solution. So we have here a hollow and dead tree, and in Vancouver, and here in our town, we have a tree which is alive, and for all apparent purposes, it's thriving. It's beautiful in the summer. It fully leaves out. There are no branches falling off of it, and there haven't been, at least for, 20 or more years. I understand that it has some rot in some of the branches, but if another city can save a hollow, dead trunk and spend a lot of money, effort, and knowledge, wouldn't it be a great thing to save a still alive tree in Tree City, USA? We pride ourselves on this. Just in 2012, our city entered the competition, an international competition in China, for municipal sustainable practices with the Urbana program of Tree City USA.
Sorry, that's your time.
I would like to ask, yes, I would like to ask that you consider not removing the tree, whatever bad condition the branches are in, and save as much of the tree as we can. If it's 80%, save the healthy 80%. If it's 50%, save the healthy 50%. Don't grind up the tree. And finally, as a last note, I would like to suggest that in Urbana, Tree City USA, which has participated in this competition for municipal sustainable practices with Urbana's program of Tree City USA, the X should not be the only tool of tree management.
Thank you very much, Eilina. Chris Storr.
Good evening. I'm Chris Storr. I live at 405 East High Street, not very far from here. This tree lies along the route that I sometimes take when I bicycle into work, so I get to see it in the summertime. The previous speakers have spoken very well to almost every point that can be said on behalf of this. I'd say that in this cynical world, we place a great value, or our measure is mostly in dollars. But I think that in our hearts we have another type of measure. And while I don't favor emptying the treasury to save the tree, I think that if a reasonable accommodation can be made to extend the life of one of the oldest living things in our community, that we should try to do so. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Jesse Wald. He's went ahead in the line because I presume he has to get to bed to go to school. Hi, Jesse.
Good evening. My name is Jesse Wald. I live at 611 West Illinois Street. I am 7 years old, and that tree has been with me for my whole life. I really like the tree. It's the biggest tree in Urbana. Me and my dad discovered that it was the biggest in Urbana and maybe even Champaign by doing very accurate measures. It is 16 feet and 3 inches around. It's 114 feet tall, and its average canopy is 88.5 feet. I also like the tree in front of 312 South Kohler Avenue, known as the tire swing tree. That tree is what makes the house the tire swing house. Back to the big tree on high. We call that tree the biggest tree in the world, but it actually isn't. It's the biggest tree in Urbana. That tree is part of my neighborhood. If it weren't there, I would never recognize that house. When I first saw that tree the year I was born. It has been me ever since. I love that tree.
Thank you, Jesse. Brian Adams.
Good evening. My name is Brian Adams. I live a property owner in the 400 block of West Elm Street, just a few blocks away from this tree. I just wanted to repeat what's already been said by a lot of people tonight. I moved to Urbana in 1988 and took many, many walks in that neighborhood and was always amazed by that tree. And I was very, very saddened to hear that there might be a potential for cutting the tree down. So I would just urge the city to do everything in its power to try to preserve the tree any way they can. I do have another reason to be interested in the trees in this city. We have a lot of beautiful trees in this city. Recently, I discovered an unpublished manuscript It was written by Adelaide Danley, who was Joseph Royer's wife. Adelaide was the daughter of a Civil War veteran and who later became a minister and moved to Urbana. And when he was very interested in trees, he cultivated trees, he loved trees. They were very important in his life. And when he passed away in 1918, Adelaide, who was a poet, published a book of poetry about trees. And for every poem that she wrote, her sister, Nell Brooker Mayhew, who was a renowned artist in Los Angeles, did an illustration. And so I've recently working with some of the descendants of Adelaide and Nell to publish this book. And I think this would be a very fitting time to get this project off the ground in conjunction with saving one of the oldest trees here in Urbana. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I believe we're in the process of developing a web page for Urbana trees in the Arbor Division, and that might be a reasonable and a nice addition to that. David Monk.
Dave Monk, 115 North Market, Champaign. Thank you, Mike, for arranging this meeting. For me, it has more connotations. It's allowing the public to understand a tree. You know about a tree, we don't. And there's some technologies that we need to know. And it's very privileging for you to let us know and to share that information. And so I'm proud of you, what you've done. And it has other connotations for me too. If we're going to do a trail to Danville, we probably have to take out a lot of young trees. They're crud trees that are grown because there's drainage on the line. But they cover up prairie, which will reconstitute to some extent after if we do remove them. But that will involve quite a few differences of opinion, like mowing and herbiciding and questions that we don't have really good skills. So I see this meeting as just a back and forth. And Phil, I would, in reality, I'd put it in a room where we're all sitting around talking to each other. But that's not here. But I thank you very much, and I thank you for doing this.
Thank you, David, and for your many involvements in natural resource conservation. Eric Jacobson, please.
I've lived at 803 West Main Street since 1971. My position on this tree is very simple and probably an outline shared by almost everybody. If it's feasible to support the tree in such a way that it will not be a hazard to people and their property, then of course it should be supported. If not, regretfully, it should come down. But I want to say that I have a high level of confidence in our arborist to make that judgment. I think over the years that he's shown that he believes in Tree City and is conscientious and capable. And indeed did provide for life extension of this very tree at an earlier time. This has caused me to reflect on our experience at our property with big trees. When we moved to our house in 1971, there were two big silver maples on the tree lawn to the north of our house, both of which we dearly loved. One of them, the city decided needed to come down, and it was replaced with a ginkgo tree, which was initially, I have to admit, a big disappointment to me, but which I've come to love as it's grown and fleshed out and is this now giant golden spear for several days in the fall, pointing to the sky and I've taken many pictures of it at that time of the year. The other big silver maple was deemed okay, except that 10 years ago, it came down on its own. It snapped off about 10 feet above the ground. It took out a great amount of a very beautiful larch and essentially crushed a lovely crabapple on its way down. Fortunately, it didn't do any significant damage to people or property, but that was an accident. It might very well have. So in retrospect, that tree should have been taken down before the storm took it, but that's easy to say in retrospect. I'm not second-guessing that at all. I may be coming from a slightly different place with respect to the value that I accord urban trees, because I consider them objects of deep admiration, worthy of serious attempts to preserve them, but not objects of veneration. I reserve my veneration for intact ecosystems where old trees succumb to a combination of the myriad stresses that afflict all old organisms, like me, for example, and come crashing to the ground, and they open up the canopy for sunlight to enable photosynthesis in the leaves of young saplings and are absorbed into the forest floor to provide nutrient for the living plants and soil organisms. And to me, at any rate, it's in that cycle of life that I think I see most clearly the face of the deity that I choose to worship. In our managed urban landscape, I think the best way to pay respects to the God of nature is to replicate that cycle as well as we can. Indeed, yes, nurturing trees to a ripe old age, but then replace them with youngsters that are eager for their place in the sun.
Thank you, Eric. Dennis Roberts has submitted written input for Robin Arbiter, who can't be here, and asked that the note attached be read into the record. And I'll read it and so provide it for the minutes. It's dated January 15th, 2014. Dear Dennis, I support the preservation of the giant hackberry tree at the corner of High Street and Kohler in Urbana and hope that a safe and feasible way will be found to keep it a living presence in the city until such a time as it poses an unfixable public safety hazard. We humans are surrounded by animals and plants that sustain us, yet we tend to view them as giving their lives to us, when in fact they have their own lives and destinies and do not much give way to our taking. A tree that dates to the middle of the 19th century bears witness to 2 centuries of rain, drought, and other conditions in Urbana. It is a storyteller with a unique picture of Urbana life recorded among its rings. Is it ready to stop telling its story? Are we ready to interrupt it if it is not? A tree that dates to the middle of the 19th century has been a home or highway to 40 generations of squirrels and other tree-dwelling or tree-traveling quadrupeds. 40 generations of birds have built nests and raised families in its branches and have eaten its ripened fruit. Fledglings have learned to fly, and hawks and owls have hunted in its shadows, while possums and raccoons have rested in its arms. Is its capacity for providing home, shelter, passage, and food at an end? Can we aid it so it may serve a few more generations? We will say goodbye to this tree one day. It will come down, and when it does, the creatures it shelters, the birds who return to it year after year, will feel the way we do when a landmark that anchors us disappears. They will adapt because they must, but we, to whom the tree provides one of the greatest gifts of all, oxygen, should, I think, be compassionate and appreciative of this tree until its end. Is this its end? Or can we, with our resources, conserve and preserve it for another human generation? I hope that these considerations will be added to the substantial professional wisdom that the Public Works staff brings to the decision about the tree. Sincerely, Robin Arbiter, and it will so be entered into the record. Are there any last comments? Again, we'll have time for questions after Mike Brunk's presentation and some comments from members of the Tree Commission. So if there are any last comments, this is your chance to stand up and present. Yes.
I'm from Champaign, I'm Marilyn Silkwood.
Yes, Marilyn.
But,
If Marilyn, could you go to the microphone so we can hear you better? Thanks.
yeah, it always makes sense. Hi, it just really moved me to see the people of Urbana care about a tree. I mean, I know there are folks who say tree huggers and all that, but if you've never really leaned up against a tree and hugged it, I mean, literally, you can't appreciate what these people are doing. And as a Champaign person, I had a rental property in Urbana that had a beautiful big elm tree that came down in a storm, and it was one of the saddest things. I don't know if it was on record or whatever, but the girth was huge. And so I can appreciate their fighting for this tree, and I think the encouraging thing is that people seem to feel they could support a program if it can be saved through means that might be a little costly, but keep the tree, for a few more generations. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Marilyn. All right. Yes, David.
Regarding the expenditure, I think the feeling is that that if a call were made for finance, the public would come through. I don't think it has to be dependent on the city.
Okay, so noted, and I suspect there are those in the room who would rally to support some private finance for any future actions. Thank you, David. Michael, would you like to proceed? And again, please hold your questions until after Michael's presentation and a few words from the Tree Commission. The presentation should be displayed on that monitor and this one here as well. Yes, could we dim the lights a bit?
I'm glad we had a tree hugger in the crowd. Not that I don't think you all are, but it's a good beginning of my experience with this tree because I have hugged this tree from top to bottom. Back in 1985, I started with the city of Urbana as the city arborist, and one of the first areas of adventure, I guess you might say, for me was to climb trees. And Will Abbott, the forestry supervisor at the time, got us in some of the largest trees in the community, a lot of which were in Carl Park, and it was scary. Going up that high, but it was a good way to get us used to climbing. And I wanted to tell Jesse, I love this tree as well. I consider this tree my friend. I started out just a couple years into the city, and we put some cables in this tree. And it was because I think the city of Urbana this program, I want to say, started because of the desire to learn about trees and to preserve trees in the community. We had a devastating Dutch elm disease come through the community, and we lost a lot of trees. So it was decided that they wanted to have an expert program, an expert arborist and a program that nurtured trees in this community. So the tree's been long-standing, the program's been a long-standing preservation program. We not only preserve our community trees through pruning, but also through public education, because city public trees aren't the only trees in the community, there's also private trees. So we do a lot of public education, and of which we recently have come up with our legacy tree ordinance. We have been working on this for a number of years, and we think we came up with a very good way to acknowledge some of our significant trees. certainly not just public trees, but private trees as well. And the idea behind the program is not just to acknowledge the trees, but the real purpose of this program is to preserve our trees. We think through acknowledgement, by getting people more knowledgeable of the different and significant trees we have the community around the community, will help us preserve the trees. And in fact, the community of Urbana on several occasions have protected trees from devastation. So this is heartfelt. This is a situation where I get to experience things that have happened in the past in our program and in our community and actually save trees. And the several that I can think of, there's a big ginkgo tree on McCullough that was doomed through construction of a apartment complex. The people spoke up, and the developer listened to the city and the people and designed that apartment complex around that ginkgo tree. So that was wonderful. There was also another tree on the side of that development that is a large, it's a magnolia. Help me out, Bruce. It's a Sweet Bay magnolia. It's a semi-evergreen tree on the west side of that apartment complex that was also salvaged because people spoke up. I think our Legacy Tree Program is a very good start to that, and I'm very excited about it. I have nomination forms in the back of the room for people to pick up if they're interested. I also have a series of notable trees in the back that people can look at and visit. And I want to talk just a little bit about the Legacy Tree Program because this tree was nominated. And that was brought to me, and I'm by ordinance to assess that tree. And then if it meets the assessments in the ordinance, then I pass it on to the Tree Commission for its vote on whether it would be designated or not. The Legacy Tree Program is not just for large or historic trees, but you know, it's for a number of different types of significant trees in the community, whether it's due to size or rarity or history or because it's a well-known location, the aesthetics, very beautiful or unique tree, special ecological value. We've got some really rare trees in the community, whether it's on the Illinois Big Tree Register, so it's not limited. And in our inventory that we completed this summer, we noted about 88 trees that I was aware of, both on private and public property, that I think are very interesting trees. And I hope a good portion of them do become legacy trees at some point in the future. And those trees are notable, titled notable, and I have that listing in the back. And for the first time, I'm going to present our interactive map of the Urbana street and park trees. This is brand new. We've been working out some incompatibility problems with different browsers on it, but on this website, you can see our trees, street trees, and the park trees. And it will give you the ecological value of that tree, which is really cool because it gives a real-world value of that tree. And what it's worth to our community, as well as groups of trees or the entire city as far as that goes. But then we also have trails. We have a fall color trail. We have the Hickman Tree Trail on there. We have the Illini Grove Trail that we put on there. We started a Big Grove Trail, and all of the notable trees are on there. So it's a very interesting website, and I invite you to visit it. The 312 South Kohler Hackberry was presented to me to be a legacy tree, and it did not meet the requirements of being in good condition, so I did not pass it on to the Tree Commission for consideration. And there's by ordinance, what I am to do is I am to assess, and part of this is on the application itself that nominates the tree. First of all, we want the legacy trees to be noticeable, easily, readily visible by the public. This certainly met that. And it met a number of the legacy standards as well. But it did not meet a condition assessment. And we have, there's positive implications that we designed into this program for the purpose of this. One, we want to promote good tree care. There are fair trees out there, poor trees that certainly could be legacy trees, but they need some work. And you know, if they're on city property and we designate it as a potential legacy tree, we're going to take that tree and repair it and get it up into good condition. We also want that to happen to trees on private property because that is what's going to create longevity for that tree. Otherwise, it just stays in disrepair and its life is going to be shorter. So bringing poor and fair condition trees into good condition is a part of the reasoning behind this program and why we're looking at assessing only good or better trees. We want to promote tree repair. We also want to increase the overall forest health by doing that and increase the living legends of the community for generations to come. So we're promoting tree care. Promoting poor condition trees would not promote tree repair or care and may actually sanction leaving trees in poor condition. That's the last thing we want, and that's totally opposed to the purpose of this ordinance. Tree failure. Now we know that legacy trees are going to get publicity. We hope they're going to get publicity. More than likely they will. But if one of them fails, we can count on it getting publicity. And tree failure promotes the dangers of trees, and therefore it promotes tree removal. We don't want to promote tree removal. Rather, we want to promote tree preservation. Tree failure would also deter rather than promote participation in the legacy program. Now let's look at 312 South Kohler, the hackberry. I love this tree. I've climbed this tree numerous times. I've put 2 of the first cables in this tree back in 1987. Then the tree was hit with a devastating ice storm, and quite frankly, in my opinion, I think the tree held together better with our cables in it than it would have without them. In the 1990 ice storm, those limbs did hold in place where we had the two cables put, but there were other large limbs that failed. One of them went through the house roof and into the second floor bedroom. The tree was deemed a removal, along with a long list of removals from that 1990 ice storm. When we got everything cleaned up in the ice storm, we went back and reassessed our removals like we always do, and we will put some removals on a later list, what we call a re-inspect, and we look at other trees, can we correct the tree rather than remove it. It was decided in 1990 that this tree could be repaired, so we pursued a repair prune, and we put 2 more cables in it. That we actually have about 3 cables, oops, wrong button, on this branch over the house here, going back into the center there. In 1997, another inventory that we did saw that the tree needed a priority 1 prune, and what that means is it had questionable, most likely dead or damaged branches that were over 6 inches in diameter. So we cleaned the tree in 97, inspected it, and went on our merry way. And then recently here in 2013, in this inventory, we discovered that there was decay in critical areas. Now, I understand what everybody's saying because by passing glance, this tree seems very healthy. Most residents think of this tree as a healthy tree. On the house side, there's obvious decay. You can't see this from the street side, but on the house side, there's several areas of decay. What I don't think anybody's aware of is what is the tree doing 40 feet in the air. It's not good. There's a series of hollows that you see on the right side over here. What concerns me a great deal on the left is this is a center leader, and there's decay in the junction of those 3 major branches. And then one of those, a close-up in the center, has hardly have any live wood to it at all. And these are close-ups of that decay and that main branch juncture. So how can a tree have such damage like this and look so healthy? Well, the real reason for that is, if you look at this diagram, that the phloem and the sapwood, which is in the outer part of the tree here, this area on the outer circumference, is what transports the water and the food. So that's where the water and the food moves up and down the tree and feeds the leaves and supports the life in the tree. But that area doesn't have adequate structural strength to hold up the tree. The strength is in the interior of the branch, trunk, or roots. So let's look at my areas of concern. There are some that are obvious from the ground. The first area of concern, number one, right there in the middle, is huge. It is an area that has a major decay in the center trunk area where these three major branches are coming out. Now, there's a number of things that concern me about this. First of all, this center leader is the center part of our cabling system. Secondly, where this rot and decay is on the tension side of these branches. And in these deciduous trees, that is the critical side of branch strength. And that's where we're showing no live wood at all. And in fact, two of these limbs, and I show a blow up in the bottom corner, are cabled. And it's a good reason that they may have lasted so long without failing. If we look close at the one, and I went up, I was worried about the tree in the recent blizzard with 35-mile-an-hour winds, so I inspected it later that week. And this is what I found. The tree has failed. And this is an imminent danger that I was unaware of earlier. This horizontal crack is a crack in the wood, the structural wood, the component of the tree that is serving as the strength. This is 40 feet above. Now this branch has a cable in it. My second area of concern is the big branch over the house. It's hollow from the very top down to the bottom, and there's visible signs of decay all the whole length. While we were out there preparing to go up into the tree for the boom truck inspection after the blizzard, there's squirrels running out throughout this whole tree and in that particular branch, and they'd go in the big wound down here at the bottom where you see the little circular deal, and they'd climb all the way to the top and peek at me up at the top where the yellow circles are. So they're running through this branch. It's hollow. The other area of concern about this particular branch is on the trunk area up and down there where I've got that oval. It's sunken, and that is a sign of interior decay. And there's probably a column of decay all the way underneath that branch running down to the ground. The third area of concern is the branch attachments that have hollows and obvious decay right next to the junctions of where they're attached. That's not good, and there's several locations of larger limbs that are in that condition. And then, of course, throughout the tree, we have hollows and scars showing decay on the interior part of the trunk. In this lower portion that we see here is in the main crotch down at that area. We see decay right on the outside of the tree. And so that concerns me a great deal because that is a major area of necessary structural integrity. These other hollows throughout the tree, I did measure a number of the ones that I could get to, and on limbs that were anywhere from 17 to 20 inches in diameter, I was getting measurements of about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of sound wood. Here's the sunken area that I was telling you about that's just the opposite side of the decay that's a little higher up in the crotch. And this sunken area is an indicator of decay on the inside of this trunk. So what does this all mean? Well, all right, if we look at why the tree's healthy, we've got the transport system in area D and C and B. We've got that area transports does the growth and transports the food and the water up and down the tree, but what we don't have and what is questionable is the heartwood and a portion of the sapwood. That's the supporting pillar of this tree, and a majority of the upper branches don't have it. They're hollow, and we don't know what is substantially sound in the trunk. So we look at this diagram again. It's the heartwood and the sapwood specifically that is the strength of the branches, the trunk, and the roots. The bark, cambium, and phloem do not provide strength and support, and that's what we're seeing from the outside. Those things are intact, but they don't apply the support, structural support for the tree that we need, that we want. So I was asked, can we cable this? Well, we have cabled it, and in fact, I think the tree would have fallen apart in 1990 if it wasn't for our preservation efforts back, what was that, 24 years ago, back in 1990. This tree, I believe, would be on the ground or non-existent if it was in a field or a natural area. I think we have preserved this tree. But let's look at cabling. Can we redo it? Can we take these cables out and do a better system? Well, my first concern is the rotten crotch area at the branch connections. I don't think we can do that because that's not going to help that area at all. That is an imminent failure waiting to happen. But even if we could, even if those weren't there, if we look at how to cable the tree by ANSI standards, which is what I'm showing you here, this is industry standards that we're to follow. First of all, we have lag screws in the upper portions of these branches because they were solid at the time, and we put lags into solid wood. Well, now they're hollow. So now we have a lag screw that has less wood to hold on to. So they're not as strong as what they were. So they're waiting to fail. But even if we could put bolts through these branches, the ANSI standards suggest to us that branches or trunks, and this you'll see that I've highlighted down at the bottom, with less than 30% of sound wood should be considered for removal rather than cabled or braced. And if we go back to what I had measured in some of these laterals in the upper right-hand corner here, this 1.5 to 2 inches was 16 to 22% of sound wood at best. We can't cable the top of this tree. It just doesn't have the sound wood that it needs for that. So what are we left with all these things to do with this tree and all these problems? What can we do? Well, the cabling system that is supported by the main center leader, that needs to come down. Those leaders need to come down. There's nothing to hold those together. We can't bolt those together. The one has already failed. So that is my first area of concern. That has to go. And if we take that out, we breach the cabling system that we have in there. There's one cable left that's holding this branch over the house out of the 3 that is presently holding it. So that's one concern. The other concern is a tree moves as a unit. And over 30 years, the wood has strengthened itself in such a way that it's used to this movement as a unit. If we take a cabling system out of that limb, all of a sudden the limbs are moving in individual style. They're dancing alone, if you will, and there's a lot higher probability that they're going to fail because they're not built that way. They're not built to withstand those kinds of tensions and pressures. So that's a concern. So I look at the removal of both of those limbs then over the house and the middle center leader as an absolute necessity. The other concern that I have is one cable, as it stands now, the tree is an imminent failure, but it could be catastrophic because everything is so questionable right now with the cables that if the house limb was to go, it very well could pull the other 3 that it's tied to right over onto the house. So what do we have left if we take that off? We still have a questionable tree left. And, you know, as I look at all of this, and you'll see the people that I looked at it with and I discussed it with, the main concern in a lot of this particular tree is this stuff, this rot, this decay, these hollows are near branch attachments. Gosh darn it, if they could have been somewhere else and we had a solid area next to the attachment, it would be a different picture. But all these darn things are next to the branch attachments, so even if we leave the tree in a condition like this that takes those 2 imminent dangers out of the tree, we have this top branch, this center leader, and then this other branch that goes, this higher one that goes over the street, are hollow next to their connections. So I would not recommend leaving the tree in this condition. So what's that leave us when we take that out? it leaves us one solid branch that it looks as though it's connected to the tree in a solid fashion, but we won't know until we get the tree down to this level and we could look at the decayed portion of that trunk. Now, we'll be able to visually see it at this point and decipher how decayed that is, but I would suggest that this tree is still a risk. We wouldn't want to leave something like this without a very close study to the trunk, maybe a tomograph or something along those lines to actually see inside the tree, because the visual signs on the outside are saying it's got decay inside of it and it's structurally compromised. But there are reasons that I think we shouldn't leave the tree in this condition, not just because of risk. It just promotes bad arboriculture. Urbana has been Tree City USA since 1976, and we've been an example for the state of Illinois and a good part of the Midwest for that same time period. We're looked at as a leader in urban forestry. We're looked at by from the residents as how do we take care of our trees. What we don't want to do is illustrate bad practices, bad arboricultural practices. Who knows? Somebody driving by this tree will think, gee, that's how you handle a large tree next to a house. I better get those limbs that are over my house cut off. Or an unscrupulous tree cutter, I won't even call him an arborist, may use it as an example that this is what you need to do to these large trees. I mean, there's a lot of profit in the private industry in tree removal. But what about the appearance of the disrepair to the neighborhood? I don't think it serves a good purpose for that. And then we talk about costs. I talked to the contractor. I said, how could we go about this removal, and how would you go about it if we wanted to preserve a portion of it? First thing he said was, I need to get the limbs off over the street first in order to access the rest of the tree with my crane. And I said, well, stop there, Mike, for a second, because that's the limb we want to save. Those are any of the limbs that we could possibly save are on the street side. And he goes, well, that poses a problem. It's going to make the removal a lot more difficult. Not that he couldn't do it. It's going to be more difficult, probably more costly. So the costs increase. And then, of course, we'll have to come back 6 months in a year and take the rest of it down. Is the foliage even able to support the tree in this stage? I don't think it's enough to even support the tree in this stage. And will the trunk stand like a cedar or redwood? No. Cedar and redwoods are rot resistant. Hackberry isn't. That's part of the problem we got here, is this darn thing's rotting and decaying. Hackberry is just not a good wood for being outside. But in furniture and man-made things. It doesn't last very long on its own. But also think about, something like this drawing the public to a potential risk. That's a part of my job. I have to look at risks, and my job is to make the urban forest safe for you all. In fact, I have to say, and I tell a lot of people this, when I worked for the Shawnee National Forest, it was OSHA standards for us to wear a hard hat when we went into the forest. We live in a forest. Now, rather than the city require you to wear all hard hats, we have an arboriculture program. And our job is to go around and abate hazards and trim trees to make them safe. And the best way we can do that is not so much going out and looking at them for where they are here and there, is actually going down the street, doing one tree at a time, and doing preventative maintenance. And that preventative maintenance gets us in the trees and cycling through the trees as often as we can, and that preserves our forest. I'm all about perpetuating our urban forest. And it's through tree care, it is through tree removal, but it's also through replacement. I'd much rather remember our hackberry tree, my friend, as it currently stands, rather than some poor example of arboricultural pruning, whether it be option 1 or option 2. And so I stand by my recommendation after talking to my friends and fellow arborists, showing them pictures. I do want to thank Dr. Howard for providing Jeff his and I think Jeff's going to read it to you, his opinion. Mark Dunteman, I thank him. He's specializes in tree forensics. And there are some foresters and certified arborists that I talked to and showed pictures. And I appreciate their input and guidance on this. And I also want to remind people of our interactive map on urbana.mytreekeeper.com. Thanks for your time and listening.
Thank you very much, Mike. As Mike alluded to, I met on Monday with Dr. Richard Hauer from the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point. We were meeting on another matter, and it occurred to me that his expertise as a sort of a national authority on tree risk assessment and author of a Forest Service classification system, a numerical system for rating tree hazards, would serve well as a second opinion in this case, this being a very important decision and something worthy of all the outside consulting that's listed here. But I just received an email response this morning in form of a letter, which is submitted for the record in the meeting minutes for today, and I'll read the highlights in interest of saving time. First of all, he's impressed with the citizen interest and responsiveness of the city in this issue and the concern for the tree. And not all cities are as fortunate as Urbana in having mechanisms for taking public input and dealing professionally with tree issues and management. He inspected the tree in the field. Steve came out and we had some discussion. And neither of us said anything that would bias his opinion. We just made a conscious effort not to present opinions. Steve did, and I did myself. And again, skipping over some of the minor stuff, he also inspected the same images that you saw. And some of his observations are that decay is apparent at the location where main branch leads connect to the trunk. So in other words, where all these major branches connect, the tree is rotten and liable to fail and to fall at that rotten juncture. And again, there's one possible exception. Horizontal cracking was noted on a main lead, and this is significant in that it's an indication that failure is occurring. Not that failure will occur, but that it's started to occur. There's already mechanical separation of woody material in the tree. And he also observed multiple vertical cracks associated with past branch wounds. And it was kind of interesting to note from his initial ground observation, the tree looked pretty healthy to him too, though he did note some major defects from the ground. But looking at the 40-foot above ground perspective, and putting all this together, he used a system to rate the risk, and he helped develop this for the USDA Forest Service. It's a numerical risk rating that has a scale, uses a scale from 3 to 10, with 10 being the highest potential for risk to public safety. And it's based on other factors. And if the tree is literally falling on your head, you might get a rating of 11 or 12. In that case, the branch would have to be dangling overhead, that sort of thing. But anyway, normally risk ratings go from 3 to 10, with 10 being the highest risk. And the factors that are quantified are probability of failure, size of the branches or parts that are potential failure, probability of target, is it going to fall on anything, or is it out in the woods where if it falls nobody will hear it? Or it may not make a sound, or whatever the old adage is. Other risk factors based on professional judgment. And based on his risk rating, and again I'll enter the documents that have been developed for this risk rating, he came up with a 9 to 10. And this high risk rating is of very great concern, and that this tree could fail at any time. It may not fail right away, but the potential exists for a tragic outcome when this tree fails. And so that's a second opinion on the mechanical condition of the tree. And with that, if there's any more information the commission would like to present with respect to the condition of the tree or that's relevant to questioning, please do that now. Then we'll open it up for your questions to Mike primarily, I guess, or to anybody on the commission.
Jeff, there was one thing I forgot to mention.
Okay.
Was we have looked at propagating this tree, and I've talked to Jeff actually, and we think we can propagate the tree through cuttings and plan to do so. And the other idea that, and the mayor's idea was to propagate this. I thought it was a great tree. We tried this once with some pine cones with the pine near the Lincoln tree, and we were unsuccessful with that. But we think we can propagate this tree through cuttings. But the other idea is that we would leave the stump and let it naturally propagate in its place without removing the storage system of the roots. So that's another idea that I thought was a pretty good idea in propagating it. I've looked into preserving wood components of this tree. We don't know what kind of cookie we would get out of the trunk because we don't know what kind of condition the interior of this trunk is. The polyethylene glycol material that we'd have to use to soak this in so it wouldn't crack isn't cheap. I'm getting quotes from Dow Chemical Company, but at the last time I remember a 50-gallon drum, and it's somewhere between 40 and 70 gallons, 50 gallons, I guess it's 70 gallons of area. I'm not sure exactly how much we need for the stump, but it would be between, my guesstimation is 30 to 50 gallons. But a 50-gallon drum is around $800. So if we've got a sufficient cookie and there's others besides our community that would be interested in one, that might be a possibility. It costs a little money, but also it may be a revenue way to generate some revenue too, and to promote our legacy tree program. Whether we make, and I'm open to the advice of the public and the input. I really believe in brainstorming on these kinds of things, whether we make the wood and use it to make plaques, keychains, cookies. I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities. Propagating seedlings to plant around the community are some thoughts.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Not wanting to anticipate any given outcome, nonetheless, I went ahead and have been able to secure greenhouse space and cloning expertise to clone the tree from hardwood cuttings, or if the tree is cut, and the stump is left intact, to get cuttings from sprouts, which are easier to propagate. And I especially like the idea of perhaps using, depending on its condition, the standing stem as some sort of tribute to the tree. I think that's worthy of consideration. And not to be too rigid with respect to this legacy tree issue. I think it might even be possible to have an honorary inclusion of this as the first tree, and recognize it as it is, no matter what the outcome of today's meeting. And certainly if a physical monument is left, or if we have monuments in the form, or relics in the form of cookies displayed in various public buildings, like you see with redwood cookies and other large trees in national park areas and areas where they relate to his natural history of areas. So anyway, if there's no other input, let's open it up to questions. I presume most of them will be for Mike, but you're welcome to talk to any member of the Tree Commission. We have citizen members, expertise in plant ecology, entomology, horticulture, some citizen representation, and my background's in tree physiology and biology. So, go ahead.
So, yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Mike. Thank you so much for doing a very good visual demonstration of the things that you were able to see at 100 feet up in the air. When we are looking from the floor, things look a lot better. It's kind of disappointing to find out that maybe the tree is farther along in failure than we expect it to be. I certainly would recommend if anything's going to be done. When we haven't gotten the vote yet, but keeping 25 feet of trunk is certainly monumental and would be certainly something to consider as the root system of this tree is fantastic to look at and is very visible from the street. And there was a failure of a similar heighted tree. I don't know if it was as tall. It was also a hackberry tree in my neighbor's yard. It was in the center of the yard. It was double trunked. During a really high windstorm, half of the trunk did split because the branching was originated at about 6 feet above the ground. And so that was a rather weakened structure compared to this tree, which is columnar and monumental up to 25 feet. That's the second story of the house. Even though one half of the tree fell, and it fell across the yard and into my yard, but nothing was damaged, the other half of the tree looked completely fine and didn't show any damage from that windstorm, but it was topped. And even after it was topped, the tree attempted to grow, and sprouts were coming from it, which I thought was incredible. But then the new property owner who purchased the house took it even lower. However, there is still about an 18-foot monumental stump in the backyard. It's no longer providing the canopy spread that it once did, which was the biggest tree, certainly in my part of the neighborhood. But, its day had come. So I would recommend that. And I wanted to ask one other question. In reading the Legacy Tree program, I mean, I think that if we're not going to have a discussion about being able to save the tree in any kind of really considerate way, and if it's not appropriate to keep some branches alive and growing as they are, even though we do severe pruning, and I know that I've seen other trees in other communities where that was attempted. And I'm thinking particularly now of a tree in, it's a giant Osage tree in, and I wanted to say, not Kankakee, but there's another community that starts with a K, and I didn't write it down, I guess, that kept a tree growing on its main street. The tree was tilted at like a 15-degree angle, and a severe part of the top was gone, but it was still growing sideways up pretty far. That tree was a notable tree for their community. But the ordinance is really interesting because they talk about, on Section 4 of the ordinance, about the nomination process and consent from private property owners. And of course, this ordinance is mostly, for us as citizens to understand and know how to nominate a tree. On page 4 of the ordinance, right after they talk about the benefits available to the property owner for nominating the tree, recommended best practices for long-term health that are offered by the city, it talks about Section 6, evaluation. And I'm just going to read the paragraph that this instructs the public. In the event that the property owner on which the nominated tree is located provides written consent of participating in the Legacy Tree program, the city arborist shall conduct a Legacy Tree assessment. Now, okay, we are the city. The community is the property owner of this tree. As defined in Section 11 of this ordinance, to ascertain whether or not the nominated tree meets the street standards for legacy nomination. And it says in the ordinance that, I'm going to page 6 now, by undertaking a legacy tree assessment, as defined in Section 11 of the ordinance, regarding whether a tree qualifies for legacy tree status, the city will not assess whether or not the location or the condition of the tree presents any hazard to human life, health, or safety, or injury to property. So I don't think we have a double standard here about nominating a tree. We're the city, the community is the property owner of this tree. Mike is managing it for us, of course. But if the community is allowed, if the property owner of a tree, of an area, a viable tree, wishes to make the nomination, the assessment will not evaluate the hazard. It will evaluate the quality of the tree by the different standards that are present: size, beauty, aesthetics, habitat, special ecological value, history, age. And as we did point out, certainly this tree merits that recommendation on at least 6 points, I think. So I guess my question is, my advice is that if we can have a fair playing field in the community, I certainly would encourage the commission to accept, perhaps is a unique expression, this particular tree as a heritage tree before it disappears from our landscape. And we do know that there are procedures to declassify a tree. But if we can make this tree certainly our first honorary heritage legacy tree, the community has said to me that they would love to have a community photograph of people, invite people to stand at the tree should anything be done to it severely. And I would think that if we could have time to arrange for some kind of ceremonial photograph, and perhaps then, the legacy tree provides ways of making markers. I appreciate that you offer to make a cookie of it. I would say a cookie is last chance.
Tonight is one idea.
It's just an idea, but it's pretty much a defeated moment for the tree itself as a living entity when it comes to cookie time. So I would hope that you would at least be inspired to allow the nomination to proceed, even though it perhaps is not strictly the way it was expected to be written. And so I don't know if I guess I would just ask that the commission make that deliberation part of your discussion.
Well, I'll let Mike respond to particulars, but I think in terms of rigidly adhering to these technical points, I don't see any problem with looking at a nomination of this tree, making an exception in this case. But I'll let Mike address the issue.
To answer your question about the assessing trees on private property, that language was put in there by our legal department, and they may be able to answer your question better. But the way I understand it is the city does not want the city arborist assessing hazards on private property because it brings liability to the city. So that's the specific reason for that particular statement, is that when we go on private property to assess whether a tree is a legacy tree or not, that private property owners are not to rely on my opinion, and nor will I assess the tree for safety reasons for them. So that's what that statement's about. If we make the tree, my concern about designating the tree as a legacy tree before we remove it is there's a 45-day grace period that we hold on taking those trees down. This is an imminent hazard.
Okay. Any other questions, please?
Mike, on that, first of all, thank you for your presentation and for the diligent work that has occurred since public concern about the tree was made known. I think it's just a fabulous job and effort that's been expended by everyone here. But Mike, on that last point, a legacy tree that's found to be in compromised condition in any way under the ordinance can be expressly removed at the arborist's discretion without further ado, can it not? The 45-day waiting period only applies to a healthy tree, and you've already determined this tree is not in healthy
I'd have
condition.
to study the ordinance.
It's pretty
to see
clear.
if
I've studied the ordinance closely.
I'm not opposed to honoring this tree. Don't get me wrong.
Oh, no, I don't.
But I think what we don't want to do is tie our hands from getting this tree down ASAP, because I'm afraid of catastrophic failure. That's my fear.
Well, I'd encourage anyone to scrutinize the ordinance as written. It has 3 layers of assurances that a tree that's an imminent hazard or even just simply in decline can be removed without delay, without public notice, and without public comment or a waiting period. So I don't see anything in the legacy tree designation that would constitute tying the city's hands another way. And I also wanted to speak to one other point about the underlying purpose of the Legacy Tree Program and the role that that good or better condition determination and criteria plays. Mike explained that if a tree can be brought into good and better condition and designated as a legacy tree, that would promote good tree management, good tree care, and promote tree health, which I would definitely agree with. But in the case before us, the tree's evident, sailing past with flying colors on all the criteria that a community may choose to honor and designate and recognize a significant tree, is being held up by its condition. And in this case, the only acceptable treatment for the condition is the tree's total removal. So in this case, the legacy tree ordinance would be being interpreted in a way that kind of keeps the community doing from what it wants to do. The last thing is the legacy tree program. Mike, you cited that its real purpose is to preserve trees, which I agree is an important indirect endpoint of a program like that. But its proximal function, and really its only provision, is to provide public notice and a waiting period if a tree is healthy prior to its removal. That's what the Legacy Tree Program really does. That's the substance of it. And how that ultimately affects the preservation of trees is one thing, but the public shares a lot of interest that have other interests in their trees that having public notice about an impending removal is extremely important to people. You've heard about it tonight for several hours. People have personal connections to trees. Sure. People want to know when they're going to be removed. They want to be told. They want to come to understand it. They want to have a chance to interact with the decision. And again, not to repeat myself, but I concluded my remarks by saying the transparency that was and the input that was granted to this tree is the perfect demonstration of how public input can improve an outcome. I can't imagine a circumstance in which it would not. And so is it a bad idea to start the first legacy tree with a heartbreaking tree removal? I say not at all. Here is the legacy of this tree. It created momentum and public support for Urbana to get the political will and bravery to join the hundreds of other communities in the United States who provide public disclosure and for public input for any tree removal. This is not an exceptional or radical idea. This is standard business procedures in most places that I've lived. And we've got a gorgeous and beautiful forest and canopy here. And I would just ask the commission and the arborist to consider taking a step that many others have, which is to be fully transparent about each year's tree removals and listen to the public about it. I think it's going to create an ongoing dialogue with the community around trees that is only to the betterment and more thorough engagement of the community with its trees.
Yeah, thanks. I would say that with respect to your comments, I'm willing to be flexible with respect to in discussions with the Tree Commission in an honorary designation of this tree, insofar as it doesn't present problems for public safety, and again, it doesn't interfere with timely removal of a tree if that's what is deemed by vote to be necessary. I think these rules are trivial, and again, I see your intent is not to delay the treatment of the tree, but to memorialize it, and I don't see any problem with working that in. And also the other, it would be a fitting memorial to have a record of this tree, and also demonstrate that we care about trees, and that sometimes they fall apart just like we do, and we approach the issue with great concern and an immediate instinct to preserve the tree at all costs if possible, and that's what we're talking about here. Yes, please. Yeah. Questions, comments?
I would like to thank Mike Bronx for his presentation. It was extremely useful and extremely enlightening. And I would like to thank you for your presentation. It was also very useful, and I think the basis of any decision-making has to be thorough examination and presentation of the results. Without that, we are just talking in the air. So it was great. But it also revealed a couple of things. We understand that the majority of the crown is in pretty bad shape and is in imminent danger of falling. I do a lot of research and scientific work, and I look at things with those eyes. But we still have a trunk here to talk about, and we talked very little about that. It was said that we don't know what condition the trunk is in. So here is my first question. Once the crown is removed, how does that affect the trunk? A huge weight is removed. So even if the trunk is hollow inside, which we don't know, I imagine that the absence of the crown will pose less danger for the trunk to fall. I don't know. This is my question to the experts. First question. Second, since we don't know what condition the trunk is in, I would suggest if the branches need to be cut because they pose imminent danger, let's cut them down. And in the meantime, let's examine the trunk, because we may have a fantastic, good trunk, or good enough for so many 50, 100, whatever more years. You said that it's bad practice to preserve trees without their crowns or partial crowns. I have questions about this too, especially first, the partial crowns. We have the electric company that goes around in our city, in our state, in our country, and cuts huge sections out of trees. Cuts huge trees into tree crowns where the lines are going, cuts trees in half where the lines are growing, leaves individual branches. And are those considered poor arboreal practice? Why do we allow that? First. Second, this tree is not a hut. This is the Acropolis. This is a huge tree. I'm an archaeologist by training, and I have seen and worked with many archaeological sites and ruins. When you go to Athens, you go to the Acropolis, most of it is gone. But there are still columns and fragments of sculptures, pediments. The roofs are gone. You go to the Roman Forum, hardly anything of it is left. But we still admire those places. There is something magnificent about them. We love going there. They are the tourist attractions. We want to learn about them. This tree is the Acropolis. This is a column, an ancient column. This is the best ancient column that we have in this city. I suggest we don't look at it as if it was just a little hut. I understand that the inside of a hackberry tree may rot very fast once the crown is gone and the cedar is more rot resistant. But I would just like to point out that the cedar I was talking about was entirely rotten inside. Entirely. There was nothing left to it. This tree was actually dead. Not only the inside was totally gone, it was just a hollow shell from the bottom to the top. It also rotted. But people saved it. It had no crown. It had no life. But it was a column from the Acropolis, and people appreciated that. They wanted to save it. Saving it was very difficult because the board, park commission or board did not want to save it at all because it presented imminent hazard. And they did not want to spend money on doing anything with this 1,000-year-old tree. Eventually, they were convinced to give time to consider ways to save this dead shell of a tree. The people got 150 days, and they were able, with university professors, to come up with some method that has never been used anywhere. It was specifically designed for this tree, to save it for longer. And how did they make it look not scuzzy? They cleaned it up. They made a beautiful area around it. It was part of a park. And they put up a sign about the history of this 1,000-year-old tree. I think we could also do that. Take this opportunity to draw attention to the big trees in our town. If the crown has to go, the column will still stand there. Preserve the column as it is, and put up a sign about the history of that tree and the history of the area, because it's a historic area. High Street was one of the early streets in this town. It's on the original map of Urbana. That part was subdivided in 1858 among the early subdivisions in Urbana. So both the area and the tree are historic. Put a sign at Lincoln and Green, largest hackberry tree in the state. If it turns out to be that it's the second largest, say largest hackberry tree in Urbana, and put a map next to it with all the largest trees in Urbana. Educate people about big trees and send people to the other big trees to admire them and love them and implant the love of trees in them. This is my suggestion. Thank you.
As I commented earlier, I like your idea for a monument, and I'm going to bounce the question over to Mike about the feasibility and the hazard of leaving some portion of the stem intact, subject to periodic inspection and after seeing what's inside. And, again, if this would prove to be a viable idea, this might be an opportunity for fundraising by citizens to erect the sign and perhaps mulch around the tree to protect the site from visitors who are going to come to look at it. So, Mike, what about the mechanical issue here?
So if we leave leave the tree with the one solid limb that seems solid from the outside. We have this branch over the road that was posing a difficulty when the contractor and I talked about its removal. That's the limb that he wants to take off in order to access the rest of the tree to take those limbs off with the cables, because it's a tedious task. We don't know what's going to happen when we take the weight off the cable and the process that he has to go through to take these branches down. This makes it more difficult.
Yeah. I don't think we were necessarily talking about even leaving the branch.
Oh, just
or
the trunk.
Nor were we necessarily talking about leaving the whole trunk.
Yeah.
As I understand it.
I don't. I think that leaving the trunk issue is a good idea. I mean, it's an idea that we could utilize, and I don't know how high we want to leave it. But I guess what I had envisioned was leaving a trunk that people could sit on, look at, count the rings, things like that to interact with, because there's a number of things you can do with something like that. And then, of course, the tree's probably going to sprout if we don't grind the stump out and the roots. It has storage down there, so I'm really hoping it sprouts, and then we've got a sapling that's growing in the same location that we can train. So I mean, it's Mother Nature. This tree, I forgot to mention, has seen its natural life. I looked up, well, how old do these trees grow? And Michael Durr stated 150 to 200 years. He saw some in the Ohio valleys, I believe is what he said, with a diameter of about 5 feet. That's this tree. This tree has seen its natural life, and by golly, it's seen it in an urban area. So it's special. And I appreciate all of you that feel the same way. It is special. And can we leave a legacy of it somehow? I think we can through innovation. I think we can.
Okay. Thank you for your idea. Yes, David.
In the vernacular, tremendous. That's what this meeting was about. I think your information is very helpful. There is other information about other trees. I like the idea of using this as a teaching aid. In other areas, the tree has become a legacy, even though it wasn't at the moment.
Good point.
It becomes a historic part of your community. I'm dreaming about the pollinator building and a little shack down there in the forestry department, and I'm always wondering if you did have to dig up the stump. Some of these stumps go into museums. I still have a piece of the Greta oak, the Greta Busey oak that you were talking about, with all its rings, because it had to go if the ginkgo was saved.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we can do things with this. Thank you.
Yes, please.
I really appreciate all the information. I guess my first question is, because I'm not as familiar with hackberries, is if we were to leave a fairly tall stump, is it if the stump was solid, is it likely that it would sprout near the top and provide further branches? I guess that's one part, and then I have a comment.
It could be. Depends how much life we have in the root system. The problem with sprouting, much like the problem with utility pruning, is it's very aggressive. So aggressive pruning makes for advantageous growth. That growth unfortunately, doesn't have strong attachments. So that's why we, for so many years, have tried to educate the public that topping is bad. Because arborists in the past, or unscrupulous tree cutters, will shear a tree and say it makes it safer. Well, it doesn't. It makes it more unsafe, because all that sprouting that comes back out of those cuts, once it gets big, it's not attached very well. In fact, hardly at all. So it comes crashing down once it gets of size. So, I mean, could it sprout? It might. I question whether it would have any life in it with the little foliage that we could leave, but if it did, it probably wouldn't have a long life.
Yeah, if it's possible to do that experiment, I would be in favor of it, simply because it would still add a lot of beauty. If it's not possible and the tree has to be cut down fairly low, I would hope that we might see it sucker. We should certainly, I hope, try, although there's no guarantee for a tree this old. But if it did, or I would hope that we would make it so that people couldn't walk on it. It would be really great if we did have to cut it down that low, that we would have a cross section next to it that could be part of an informational plaque. For example, if that cross section were fairly solid, one could actually find out how old the tree was. And one could put markers and say these were various points in the history of Urbana at these points in time, and here's the tree regrowing. Because, these old trees, as you say, they grow to about maybe 200 years old, and they might fall down, and then they might resucker, and that's part of the cycle of life of this tree species. So then that would be potentially part of the educational plaque that could go with it. This is what would normally happen, except, of course, here it's an urban area. We had to manage it. So that could be useful. If you do clone it, and it doesn't survive in its current location from suckering, then maybe a clone of it nearby would be great. But I would also caution against planting a lot of clones of the same genotype of a tree throughout a large area of the city. It would be better to have the genetic diversity of progeny for the sustainability of that species. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I'd like to add a few more. The hackberry is difficult to propagate from hardwood cuttings. Those are the ones you get now. Difficult but not impossible. So if it were cut, the plans would be, the plans are in place to take literally hundreds of 8-inch hardwood cuttings that contain buds to do that. If it sprouts, sprouting will be dependent on the carbohydrate reserves that are in the tree right now. the tree's not going to live long without much of a canopy because basically living tissue in considerable stem, sapwood, and the roots is going to go through the reserves and be depleted. And so sprouting in other parts of the stems and possibly even the stump, especially in areas where it might be wounded, is likely to be ephemeral, but there are also plans in place to take, if it sprouts, if it's cut, that hasn't been decided yet, and if it sprouts, to take these greenwood cuttings, which are easier to propagate, as a backup, secondary approach to preserving this plant. And the fact that it lives so long may mean that this particular tree has some unique genetic characteristics that contribute to its survival and livelihood. And again, that's another way to memorialize a tree that's on its way down, and it has been and is spectacular as well. Okay. Yes. Stephen.
Hi again. I'll make this very brief because I didn't direct, given the sequencing of the decision, haven't talked much about disposition. I think the suggestions for preserving large portion of the trunk I sympathize with because it is such an impressive trunk, and I think part of everyone who likes this tree is impressed, perhaps, by that trunk. However, if I understand it correctly, that hackberry wood, especially once it's no longer living, is subject to rapid decay, and we preserve that, leave that section in place to become subject to rapid decay. 10 years, 20 years, 100 years from now, there'll be nothing left of that tree for future citizens to remember. So if a plan to give it more of a bench-size stump would allow us to preserve a cookie, assuming the wood's intact, and stabilize that cookie for the long term. I've been in touch with the Urbana Park District, and they expressed interest to me, and presumably arrangements could be worked out to feature such a cookie in Anita Purvis
Very
Nature
good.
Center, for example. Yeah, they were quite interested in that. And I imagine the Forest Preserve District and others would be interested in that. The other thing is it takes time to work out some of these dispositions. I'd call your attention to an incredible elm tree that came down in 2010 known as Herbie in Maine. You've probably heard of that tree? Yeah. It's in Maine, right? That community took extraordinary measures to memorialize every scrap of Herbie when it ultimately had to be removed, including making paper from the sawdust, including making cookies of every intact limb all the way to its tendrils, and preserving incredible dimension timbers and of portions of the stem that were solid. Urbana has a vigorous, a vital arts community that I don't believe is part of the conversation about this tree yet. It's been too premature to really invite them to imagine how they might use parts of this tree to create art, and proceeds of the sale of which could support tree management and be part of the legacy of this tree. Thanks.
And I don't think it has to be bench level only to get cookies. And it might be possible to get several decent cookies somewhere between the ground level and 40 feet for various displays and memorials. And so these are all, I think, elements that can be discussed no matter the outcome of the vote. Yes.
Thank you for your comments. I don't want to take up very much more time, but I would like to say that before we talk about how much of the tree trunk we should cut, hopefully we can save some. I think it would be very good to do a tomographic study on it, or whatever study is necessary to find out what's inside, because it may be that the trunk is actually in fairly good condition. This is something we don't know. And make a decision before we know what the condition is, I think, is not a good practice. If the trunk can be saved, it would be nice to save it as high as possible, and perhaps talk to people at the university to see if there are methods to prolong the inside stability of the tree as long as possible. I think what's really impressive about this tree is the whole tree is impressive, but if the crown has to go, to leave the trunk as much as we can, because it is like an old column. It's like an old column in antiquity. and it impresses people. It impresses me. And I think somebody else, I don't know the gentleman's name, suggested the idea of having a cookie, if it could be taken from higher up, and mark on it the years. And what happened in those years is a fantastic idea. It's very interesting. And use that as an educational tool set right next to the tree would be a wonderful thing for this city, and it would be a wonderful thing for the tree program here. I don't think that anything about that would look scuzzy. I think it would be something that perhaps other cities could follow. Thank you.
Whether or not the trunk is solid as a rock or has some hollows in it is kind of a moot point in that it appears the canopy is about ready to collapse. But my guess is that there should be nothing limiting us leaving a substantial portion of the trunk to examine preservation methods and to work with it. I don't think trunks like that present much of a hazard to the public, especially when you remove the weight of the crown, even if they have considerable hollowness, because there's this physical aspect of soda straw strength where you have a solid exterior. But anyway, Mike, do you want to comment on that?
I was just going to share with the Tree Commission that a tomographic test to get the contractor down here with that equipment's $1,000-ish, maybe a little less.
Yeah.
$1,000 or less, $900,000.
Again, I don't think that's critical, whether there's a little or a lot of decay. You can determine that once if the crown is removed.
We ought to be able to determine the upper portion of it at least.
You know, if it's pretty rotten or if it's pretty solid, in either case, you know, if there's some 30% mostly wood, mostly around the exterior of the tree, it's probably pretty stable.
Not to be a deterrent for that, but I just one experience I had with a log. It was on Vermont Avenue, 200 block, behind a garage. It was about 20 feet tall. I don't know why they left it, but they did, and it was very loose. So it was a neighbor of mine, and I helped him take it down. But the surprise was it was infested with termites. And so that's something to think about. I'm not saying this tree is infested with termites now, but we certainly want to keep an eye on something like that. Their house was infested with termites, and that's where it was coming from.
In any case, a memorial like that would require annual inspection at least.
It would.
And probably the thing we haven't explored would be preservation, including treating for termites in a way that doesn't introduce any toxins to people who come to visit it. And again, leaving it there for a time would allow time for exploration with the arts community and with experts in wood preservation, non-toxic wood preservation. So just, I think the Tree Commission and Mike are pretty open to doing anything that doesn't impair public safety like that. And thank you for all your comments. Yes, any other comments?
I would say that Ruth Walker had a tree that she sculpted, mother and child, that was there for years and years and years.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot up to the range of 10 feet where people who worship the morel mushroom memorialize it with chainsaw sculpture and stumps. But yes, Carol.
Well, just two comments from observations of many hours in Trelease Woods. One, among the trees there, I would rank hackberry as probably number 2 in terms of its suckering ability. It seems to sucker particularly from root systems very, very powerfully. The second is, this is a sample size of 1. A tree that came down in '86 I've been watching every year. You know, its demise, it left its trunk behind, and I would say it's highly compromised and in a state of almost collapse now. What would it be, 27 years? Since about when you started.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Be sure to turn your mic
Oh, would you?
about a 27-year life is maximum. I would say even probably 10 years ago it was looking pretty scruffy and unstable. And it was solid when it came down. I mean, it was snapped off.
And so, again, suggesting the importance, if this goes forward and people get involved, of investigating means of preservation. Okay. All right. I think we've come to the time to vote. I'd just like to make a few comments here. I've been truly impressed by this magnificent tree. Like all of you here, it blows me away when I look at it and think about its natural history and age, and it's, you get next to it and it's kind of like as close as you can get to being around redwoods here in Champaign-Urbana. And I'm amazed and pleased at all of your interest and commitment to dealing with this tree, and I'd like to also compliment Mike and for the openness and affording the ability to discuss and exchange ideas and facts. And I think we remain open to any and all public input. All of our meetings, most not focused on a sort of a contentious issue, are open to the public and they're announced, so you're all welcome to come in the future with any ideas you might have, and we welcome it. And we have frequent visitors with good ideas. I think if you need assurance, I assure you that Mike and the Tree Commission are truly dedicated to preserving Urbana's natural heritage, and we represent you and the public at large in all your interests, in our efforts, and we enlist your help, as we've done tonight, in identifying, recognizing, and stewarding elements of Urbana's urban forest, and invite you to kick off the legacy program, not just with this tree, but with some of the other magnificent trees, by nominating trees. This outpouring of sentiment and concern for preserving the tree is notable, and it's very clear. The tree's been on life support for more than 20 years. With the branch juncture rot means pretty soon all of them are going to fail, with the possible exception of one. And you need a certain amount of crown to keep the living tissue and the roots and that alive. And the reason this isn't root sprouting is the roots around the crown are intact, but I suspect there will be some sprouting when it's damaged. And we certainly need more discussion about memorializing the tree in various ways. We're going to go to vote. What the vote? To make it simple, the agenda was set up to say yes for expeditious removal of the tree, subject to consideration of this memorial tissue, the stem, the trunk. And a no vote means we're back where we started. I guess in either case, if it's a yes vote, doesn't mean it's going to be, the stump's going to be ground, or it's closed to discussion and about memorializing the tree. But it probably does mean that the canopy is going to go before the ice storm season comes around, and before it leaves out and adds considerable weight. If the commission should decide to vote no for tree removal at the discretion of the arborist, again, we're back where we started. So we're not talking about everything or nothing. There's still plenty of room for input and discussion, but we'll go through the roll call if you're ready or have no more comments. And a yes will signify proceeding and permitting the removal of the tree, or at least the crown, but the tree with consideration for memorializing the tree itself. And a no vote means no cutting or removal of tree tissue. So if you'll go through the roll call, yes means cut, no means don't cut.
Carol Augsburger,
Yes.
Stuart Burlacher,
Yes.
Jeff Dawson,
Yes.
Tom Fairman,
Yes.
Michael Stevenson,
Yes.
Okay. You look at my agenda. Is there a motion to adjourn? We're done with our business. Commission?
I so move.
Second? We are adjourned. Thank you.